Once upon a time, there lived a girl named Idara who lived alone with her handsome father. Her mother died after giving birth to her, leaving her father with the sole responsibility of caring for her for over 18 years. Her father, a deacon, took good care of her, providing her with the best of everything in life. They spent so much time together, creating a bond that seemed to be unbreakable. Idara loved her father so much and never spent a day without seeing or talking to him. Idara finally gained admission into the university. Her campus was 2 hours away, and Idara could not stand the thought of being away from her father. But her father, a deacon, encouraged her, reminding her that education was important for her future. He promised to visit her often, and Idara was so happy, knowing that her father never went back on his promises. She left for school and made new friends who made her time in school a pleasant experience. After several months away, Idara returned home to the shocker of her life. She walked into her father's mansion and was welcomed by a strange woman who introduced herself to her as her father's girlfriend. Idara stood there confused as her father walked up to her to welcome her home. He was so delighted to introduce Emem to his daughter Idara, who did not look happy to see another woman in their home. Idara forced a smile, trying to mask the storm brewing within her. She had always thought of her father as hers alone, a bond she believed was too sacred to be severed by just anyone. But Idara knew better than to show her displeasure in front of her father. She faked her smile as she warmly spoke to Emem, who was so delighted to see how happy she looked. What Emem did not know was that beneath the smile was a brewing storm of anger and resentment, which Idara was trying so hard to hide. It felt as though her perfect world had been shattered into a million pieces, as Idara felt betrayed by her father, who she never believed would ever love another woman. She felt betrayed, but vowed within herself to keep her feelings hidden for now. Idara watched Emem closely, pretending to be cool with her. They watched television together and even sat on the couch, talking and laughing for hours. Emem thought that she had won Idara over. What she did not know was that Idara was waiting for the right moment to strike. The next morning, Idara joined Emem in the kitchen to prepare breakfast. It was a beautiful morning, and her father had requested for some boiled yam and egg sauce. Emem, who was a very good cook, was making the sauce when Idara walked in to see what she was doing. "I can see that you're cooking," Idara said to Emem, who smiled and informed her that she was preparing her father's favorite meal. Idara saw this as her opportunity to sow seeds of discord between them. She struck up a conversation with Emem, asking why she had decided to stay with her father, and Emem blushed as she began to give Idara all the wonderful reasons why she had decided to stick with him. Idara could feel her anger rise. She pretended to have just remembered something as she excused herself from the kitchen. A few hours later, Emem heard her voice being called by a deacon. She rushed off to answer and realized that he was holding some items in his hands. "Why did you steal from me?" a deacon asked Emem, who stood there confused as she wondered what he was talking about. "Steal? What are you talking about?" Emem asked, her voice trembling with confusion and fear. She stared at the items in the deacon's hands, which she had never seen before. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not a thief," she said as a deacon asked her what his items were doing in her bag. Emem stood there confused as she tried to explain to a deacon that she wasn't a thief. Even Idara joined Emem to plead with her father, who threw Emem out of his house and warned her never to show up in his home again. Emem stood there confused, unable to comprehend what had just happened. All her pleading went on deaf ears as a deacon made up his mind never to have anything to do with a thief. Idara could not contain her joy. She pretended to be sad about the incident, whilst jubilating in her heart. Months passed, and the deacon moved on with his life. His focus was now solely on Idara, who was so happy to have her father all to herself. However, Loneliness began to creep into Edikan's life again. He met a woman named Ukeme, a kind and gentle woman who worked as a business consultant for a reputable company. Ukeme was graceful and had a calm demeanor, which won Edikan over quickly. When he introduced her to his daughter Idara, Idara greeted her warmly, but in her mind, she was already planning her next move. One evening, Ukeme decided to spend some days at their home. She arrived at the house and met Idara, who looked so delighted to see her. Idara even prepared a delicious meal for her, and Ukeme was so delighted to see how friendly she was to her. They spent hours discussing as Idara told Ukeme so many wonderful things about her father. Days passed and things seemed to be moving on smoothly. Ukeme could not help but tell her friends, who were so delighted to hear such positive things about Edikan and his daughter Idara. They had thought that Idara would be a problem and were relieved to hear how nice Idara was to her. Ukeme felt that she was finally becoming a part of their family, but what she did not know was that Idara was working on a diabolical plan to ensure that she never ends up with her dear father. Late one night, Idara snuck into Ukeme's room and rummaged through her belongings. She found a pair of clean panties, carefully folded in her suitcase. Idara smirked, knowing exactly what to do with the panties. She took the panties and soaked them in the sewage tank outside their home, ensuring that they were drenched in the foul-smelling water. Afterwards, Idara lightly rinsed the panties to keep the stench intact but not immediately noticeable. Then, she carefully soaked the panties in a bucket and left it in her father's bathroom. Idara knew how much her father hated dirty women and knew that her plan would definitely work. She snuck out of the bathroom and retired to her room, patiently waiting for the drama to unfold. The next morning, as Adikan prepared to take a shower, he walked into the bathroom and was hit by the unbearable stench coming from the bucket. He froze, confused and horrified, as he noticed the soiled panties in the water. Shocked, he grabbed the bucket and rushed to find Ukeme. "Are you a pig?" he asked Ukeme, who looked at him shocked. "Excuse me? How dare you call me a pig?" she said as Edikan handed her the bucket. Edikan's face was red with anger as he thrust the bucket into Ukeme's hands. "Explain this. What kind of a woman wears such a smelly and filthy pant? And how dare you leave it in my bathroom?" he bellowed angrily as Ukeme stared at the bucket in horror, the stench hitting her nose like a wave. Her voice trembled as she replied Edikan, revealing that she had no idea whose panties it was. "These aren't mine," she said to Edikan, who shook his head in disbelief. "Don't insult my intelligence. This was in my bathroom, and you're the only one who's been using it besides me." Ukeme's eyes filled with tears as Edikan ordered her to leave his home and never return. Idara rushed out and acted shocked. "Father, what's the problem?" she asked as she held her nose with her hands, asking where the stench was coming from. "Did a rat die in the house?" Idara asked her father, who revealed to her all that happened. Idara stood there and watched as Ukeme packed her things and left in shame. She comforted her father, assuring him that one day he would find the perfect woman for him, and her father shook his head in agreement as he walked off to his room, not knowing that Idara was the one behind all the terrible things that had been happening. Months passed, and once again, Edikan found himself longing for companionship. His loneliness was so undeniable, and despite his daughter's presence in their home, he desired the company of a partner. One day, whilst coming out from the barber shop, Edikan met a very beautiful woman named Idong. She was a strong-willed and confident woman who had an air of grace that immediately won his heart. Idong was so different from the other women that Edikan had been with in the past. She was observant, calm, and not easily intimidated by anyone. When he introduced her to Idara, Idong smiled warmly, but the moment their eyes met, she could sense the storm that was brewing behind Idara's charming facade. "I've heard so much about you, Idara," Idong said kindly, And I've heard so much about you too, Idara replied sweetly, though her mind was already plotting on how to get rid of her. In the days that followed, Idara studied Idong closely. She feigned friendship with her whilst thinking of the best way to get rid of her. Idara snuck into her father's room with a calabash tied with a red cloth. She put her father's picture inside the calabash, as well as other strange objects, to make it look suspicious as she hid it under her father's table. Idara did this to make her father suspect that Idong was into witchcraft. She quietly snuck back to her room, waiting for the commotion that would ensue once her father discovers the calabash under his table. Hours passed, and Idara overheard her father yelling out angrily in his room. She rushed to check if her plan had worked and met her father, who looked extremely angry at her. Is this what I sent you to the university to do? He asked Idara, who stood there confused as her father handed her an image of herself in a club, holding a bottle of alcohol as she danced provocatively with some strange boys. Idara was so ashamed of herself. She began to apologize to her father, who walked out on her, feeling so disappointed. Idara could not believe how things had turned on her. She looked under her father's table and realized that the calabash she placed under the table was nowhere to be found. Idara could not help but suspect that Idong had something to do with everything that just happened. She sat in her room, confused, when Idong walked in to check in on her. Are you okay, Idara? She asked gently as Idara looked at her with an angry scorn. Why do you care if I'm okay? She snapped, her voice sharp and condescending. Idong remained calm, her calm expression unshaken by Idara's hostility. Because I care about your father, and by extension, I care about you. I can see that you're struggling with something. If there's anything I can do to help, please let me know, she said softly as Idara scoffed and folded her arms. After what you just did, you have the effrontery to stand here and act all kind towards me? Soon enough, my father will see you for who you truly are, Idara said to Idong as she ordered her to leave her room. Idong quietly retreated, seeing how angry Idara was in that moment. A few hours later, Idara was walking past the kitchen when she realized that Idong had just prepared a pot of stew. She quietly snuck into the kitchen and poured a huge spoon of salt inside the stew and stirred it gently to dissolve the white particles of the salt. Idara quickly retreated to her room, waiting for the commotion to unfold. She heard a knock on her door as Idong came to inform her that dinner had been set. Idara gently walked to the dining table and met her father, who was already seated and ready to eat. Idara's eyes were now fixated on her father. She expected a frown, perhaps a wave of disgust, as the salty stew touched his tongue, but instead, Edikan smiled broadly, looking genuinely pleased with the food. This is delicious, Idong. I don't think I've ever tasted stew this good in my life, he exclaimed, taking another spoon of the food. Idara's jaw dropped. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had dumped an excessive amount of salt into the stew. How could he possibly be enjoying it? Doubt gnawed at her as she quickly reached for her own plate, scooping up a mouthful to taste. The moment the food hit her tongue, she gagged. The salt was overwhelming, burning her taste buds with its intensity. The food was practically inedible. She glanced at her father, who continued eating with visible delight, unaware of her shock and discomfort. In that moment, it dawned on her that Idong served her the salty food, a different one from that which her father was eating. Idara could not waste the food. Her father hated waste, and she could not let him know that something was wrong. Idara knew that her father would notice what she had done if she left her plate untouched and could not afford any form of suspicion. So, forcing a strained smile, Idara picked up her spoon and began to eat the salted stew, each bite feeling like a dreaded punishment. With every gulp, she fought the urge to spit it out, her throat tightening as she tried to swallow. Her eyes watered, but she kept going, determined not to let her father see that something was amiss. Idong, seated across the table, caught Idara's discomfort and subtly raised an eyebrow but said nothing, her expression remaining neutral. As the dinner drew to a close, Idara pushed back her plate, her stomach churning from the excessive salt. She could barely keep the food down, and her lips felt dry and parched. Meanwhile, her father Edikan leaned back in his chair, a look of satisfaction on his face as he finished up his meal. "That was truly delicious, Idong," he said, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "I'm glad you cooked tonight. You're becoming quite the excellent cook." Idara's face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. This plan, like so many others, had backfired spectacularly. She had hoped to ruin Idong's evening, but instead, she was the one left with a bitter taste in her mouth. As she rose from the table, she cast one last glare at Idong, who met her gaze with a strange smile. It was clear to Idara that her efforts to drive Idong away were only digging her deeper into trouble. She made her way to her room, her stomach aching and pride wounded. Idara knew that she was facing an uphill battle, and the stakes were getting higher with each failed attempt. The next morning, Idara sat up in her room thinking of her next plan. She could not let Idong win in her game and had to do something about it, and fast. She went through Idong's bag and came across her health card. Idara realized that Idong was asthmatic and knew that she hadn't told her father about it. Idara knew all too well that her father would never want to be with a woman who suffered from asthma. The condition had taken a heavy toll on him, as it was the same illness that claimed her mother's life shortly after Idara was born. The pain of that loss had shaped much of her father's decisions, and Idara was certain that her father would avoid anything that reminded him of her mother's death. So, Idara came up with a plan to expose Idong. She lit a candle and left it on the table in her father's bedroom. Idara believed that the smoke from the candle would trigger an attack capable of exposing Idong for who she truly was. She quickly left the house to avoid any form of suspicion and went to her friend's house, who lived a few minutes away. Idara was so confident that the smoke from the candle would create enough discomfort for Idong to reveal her hidden secret. In her mind, this would be the final blow to remove Idong from her father's life. What she did not know was that her plan was about to backfire in the worst way possible. Idara received a call from an unknown number that her father was rushed to the hospital. Terrified, she quickly rushed to the hospital and met her father, whose face and body was now badly burnt. The candle that she left on the table started a huge fire that engulfed their entire home. The curtain in the room, pushed back by the wind, caught up to the fire that began to spread around the house. Her father, Edikan, smelling the smoke, rushed in to check what was happening and met Idong collapse on the floor, close to the raging fire. He quickly rushed to save her as the fire caught up with him and engulfed parts of his clothing. Despite the pain and danger, Edikan shielded Idong with his own body, dragging her out of the house. By the time he managed to escape the flames, he had sustained severe burns on his face and body. At the hospital, Idara stood frozen at the sight of her father, wrapped in bandages, his face marked with burns. Guilt consumed her as she realized the full extent of her actions. The plan she had so carefully crafted had nearly cost her father's life. Idong, who had suffered a severe asthma attack during the ordeal, was also being treated. She lay on the hospital bed alive, all thanks to Edikan, who saved her dear life. Idara stood there shaking as the weight of her guilt pressed down on her. She watched